The 25th of October, 1944, on the bridge of battleship Yamashiro in Surigao Strait, Vice Admiral Shōji Nishimura drove his column north through darkness, broken by signal lamps, gun smoke, and the white churn of wake. The channel was tightening around him, heat hung inside the bridge, and every ship astern had to hold station after a battered approach in the night. Ahead lay Leyte Gulf. Behind him came the force he was still carrying forward by will alone: Yamashiro, Fusō, Mogami, and destroyers including Shigure. Nishimura did not break off. He continued the attack into the strait after air attack on the approach, and after mounting signs that American forces were waiting ahead, pressing a night assault deeper into confined water, because the old answer was still the answer he trusted. Nothing in his movement suggested hesitation. The column kept its head north. Signals still passed. Engines still drove. In that hour, on that bridge, he was not retreating from danger. He was carrying it forward, certain he could still reach the invasion fleet before dawn. What Nishimura could not see was already waiting above him in the dark. By the 25th of October 1944, the U.S. 7th Fleet battle line under Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf had laid a radar-directed gun line across the northern mouth of Surigao Strait. The force moving north in confidence was already entering an American system built to find it and hit it first. The end was fixed inside that geometry. On the 25th of October 1944, Nishimura's southern force was broken in Surigao Strait and Nishimura was killed. 6 old U.S. battleships waited in the blocking line. Wrecks from Pearl Harbor returned to battle in the one place his column had to reach. That is the scale of the turn. Not one ship against one ship, and not courage weighed against courage. A veteran Japanese commander was driving a night attack into a narrow passage, while an American battle line sat across its exit with the means to make darkness useless. The stakes around him were larger than his bridge. Nishimura was not leading a patrol or a raid. He was carrying the Southern Force in Operation Shō-Gō during the Leyte campaign, ordered to force Surigao Strait, enter Leyte Gulf, and strike the American landing forces from the south. If his column reached open water beyond the strait, the invasion fleet lay in reach. If it failed inside that channel, the attack ended before deployment. Everything about his formation showed what still mattered to the Imperial Japanese Navy in late 1944. The weight of the force sat in the 2 battleships, Yamashiro and Fusō. Heavy cruiser Mogami added more guns to the thrust. Destroyers, including Shigure, screened and followed in the same narrowing corridor. It was not a large fleet. It was a concentrated attack column built to pass one body of water, keep formation in darkness, and break into a crowded anchorage at the far end. That made geography part of the stake. Surigao Strait did not offer room to disappear. It forced ships into line, compressed distance between van and rear, and punished every interruption. A column moving north there had to keep order under pressure, answer contact, absorb damage, and still preserve enough shape to hit hard on entry into Leyte Gulf. The farther Nishimura pressed, the less room he had to recover from anything, and he pressed anyway. That matters, because his persistence was not drift, it was command. On the 24th of October 1944, his force had already taken air attack on the approach through the Sulu Sea and kept moving. By the early hours of the 25th of October 1944, he was still committing the same formation into the strait itself. The movement north was the decision. On the American side, the defense waiting ahead was not a single curtain of gunfire improvised at the last minute. Oldendorf held the northern exit with 6 old battleships, and that one number tells the viewer what Nishimura was really sailing toward. He was not about to emerge into confusion. He was approaching a prepared barrier whose value lay in being ready before he arrived. That is why the old ships matter. Their presence turned the northern mouth of the strait into a final line that had to be crossed under fire if his mission was to live at all. Nishimura still had his core ships around him. He still had a route. He still had purpose. But the water ahead was already claimed. From his side, the logic remained brutal and simple. Reach Leyte Gulf, and the mission still had meaning. Fail in Surigao Strait, and the force would be spent where it could do the least good, inside a channel chosen by the enemy. The confidence on his bridge was real. So was the trap forming beyond sight. His force kept acting like an attack force, because that was what it had been ordered to be. The staff, the escorts, the men at their stations, could still read the night in the old terms. Hold course, answer signals, keep the column intact, go forward. Yet the answer waiting in the strait belonged to a different kind of battle. From the Japanese side, there was still no order to turn back. There was only the pressure to continue. And beyond that pressure stood 6 U.S. battleships. The route had only one northern exit. While that line waited ahead, Nishimura's world was still in motion. On the 24th of October 1944, after air attack in the Sulu Sea, the Southern force continued its south-to-north approach towards Surigao Strait, carrying damaged confidence into darkness instead of abandoning the run. The night gave cover, but it also narrowed every margin. Engine vibration traveled through steel. Smoke drifted low over the water. Signals had to cross a formation that could not afford to spread. The force itself looked simple on paper and difficult in practice. Yamashiro led the push. Fusō followed in company with Mogami and destroyers, including Shigure. Every ship behind the leader depended on steady speed, ordered distance, and a bridge that believed the channel ahead could still be forced. One interruption in open sea could be absorbed. In a confined strait, each interruption moved aft through the whole column. That is what made the approach so tense before the decisive gunfire ever came into view. Nishimura was not racing through empty water. He was taking a damaged striking force toward a defended passage at the very hour when surprise mattered most. The men around him had to navigate wake, smoke, flashes, and reports, while still preserving the one thing the mission required: forward movement. By the early hours of the 25th of October 1944, first contact with American light forces had already signaled that the attack was no longer hidden. Gun flashes in the dark, reports from escorts, and course changes under pressure told the Japanese column that the strait was awake. Surprise had been compromised before the main blow could be delivered. Yet the force did not reverse. It kept driving north. That persistence carried its own burden. Every minute spent answering contact gave the enemy more time. Every maneuver in narrow water made formation harder to hold. Every report from the screen told the same truth in a harsher form. The farther the column advanced, the more closely it was being measured. Nishimura was still acting under the logic of attack, but the sea around him was beginning to answer under another logic entirely. For the ships astern, that meant compression and uncertainty. Distance closed. The line bent and corrected. Orders had to move through darkness already disturbed by combat. A force meant to burst into Leyte Gulf as a weapon was being forced to spend itself on the way in, one reaction at a time, while still trying to look like a coherent thrust from the bridge of the flagship. And still, the old discipline held just enough to keep the column moving. That is the last hard thing to understand before the shooting at the northern end settles the issue. Nishimura's attack was not finished when it entered Surigao Strait. It was still an attack in his own handling of it. The engines were still driving north. The leading ships were still committed to the passage. The mission still existed because he refused to surrender it to warning, air attack, or first contact in the dark. From the Japanese side, that refusal could still feel like steadiness. Hold formation, maintain course, press through. But every one of those choices increased the value of what the Americans had already prepared ahead. The escorts could report contact, and the flagship could continue. The answer waiting beyond them was 6 U.S. battleships. Behind the title of Vice Admiral stood an older education in how to fight at night. The 17th of November, 1943, at Kure, Vice Admiral Shōji Nishimura took command of the 2nd Battleship Division. He was born in 1889, but the useful fact was not his age. It was the path that brought him there. He had come up through the Imperial Japanese Navy as a destroyer officer in a service that taught night fighting as craft, duty, and faith. Torpedo attack, close approach, aggression after dark, the decisive surface action that broke an enemy line before daylight could level the odds. By late 1944, that education was old. It was not dead. Nishimura's reputation sat inside that tradition more than above it. He was not presented to the fleet as a romantic lone hunter. He was a professional product of an institution that had spent years telling itself that darkness favored nerve, discipline, and the side willing to close first. Earlier in the war, Japanese surface forces had torn into Allied ships at night and left a memory that lingered long after the balance at sea had changed. That memory mattered. It told commanders that a hard thrust through darkness could still restore terms the daylight no longer offered. On the 20th of October, 1944, As the Leyte campaign opened under Operation Shō-Gō, that belief took concrete shape in his command. Nishimura's southern force was built for one task and one route. Battleships Yamashiro and Fusō carried the weight of the strike. Heavy cruiser Mogami added another gunned hull to the column. Destroyers, including Shigure, screened the movement. The mission was direct. Force Surigao Strait, enter Leyte Gulf, and attack the American landing forces from the south, while other Japanese forces converged elsewhere. That assignment fit Nishimura because it fit the doctrine he represented. A column in darkness was not a compromise in Japanese thinking. It was a weapon. Put heavy ships in line ahead, hold speed, keep interval, push through the restricted water, and break into the anchorage before the defender could sort the attack. In that method, confusion was not a danger only for the attacker. It was something the attacker intended to give the other side. If the approach held together long enough, the narrowness of the route became an advantage. There was less room to evade, less time to think, less warning before impact. The men around Nishimura understood the same grammar of battle. Bridges, engine rooms, signaling parties, and escorts were trained to preserve ordered movement under darkness, smoke, and intermittent contact. He did not need to invent a new form for Leyte. The form already existed. It had rank behind it, habit behind it, and the surviving prestige of earlier night victories behind it. That was the circle around him. Not just ships in column, but a navy still willing in late 1944 to trust the old night answer when the waterway was narrow and the objective at the far end was crowded with American shipping. By the time he carried Southern force toward Surigao Strait, Nishimura was more than a flag officer with a mission folder. He was the custodian of a method. If that method could still work anywhere, this was where it was supposed to work. A confined passage, darkness, a concentrated striking column, a target-rich gulf beyond the exit. From his side of the war, the geometry still looked familiar enough to believe in. A staff officer could have said it in one flat sentence and meant every word. The route is narrow, the force is sufficient, and the hour is ours. He was still carrying 2 battleships. The 24th of October 1944, in the Sulu Sea, the force took air attack and kept going. That was the first proof Nishimura needed. A broken command would have scattered, slowed beyond use, or turned away before darkness. His did none of those things. The column still existed. Orders still moved. The mission still pointed north. For a commander formed by destroyer doctrine, that mattered more than damage tallies in daylight. The attack had not been canceled by contact from the air. In Japanese terms, the old method was confirming itself again. Daylight interference had failed to stop a night operation before the night began. Steel could be hit and still move. A column could be shaken and still retain purpose. That was not fantasy. It was the practical premise of every hard surface thrust the Navy had ever tried to make under pressure. If the force could reach the strait after the Sulu Sea, then the central idea remained alive. Endure on the approach, close after dark. Strike where the enemy did not want close action. The route ahead gave Nishimura another reason to trust it. Surigao Strait was restrictive, but restriction cut both ways. A line that held together in a channel could still deliver heavy ships straight toward Leyte Gulf. Yamashiro, Fusō, Mogami, and the destroyers were not maneuvering for a fleet review. They were advancing in the form the mission required. The farther north they went, the more committed they became. To Nishimura, commitment itself could look like strength. Men who still answered signals and maintained station after air attack were not a force in retreat. They were a force proving discipline under test. Late on the 24th of October 1944, on the run toward the strait, the Americans were already acting on his front, but from the bridge they did not yet present a final argument. There were reports, flashes, interruptions, movement in the dark beyond the next ship's wake. Noise, not verdict. Nishimura had seen enough war to know that a determined attack often reached its real decision point only after that first ring of friction. Until the column lost forward motion, the doctrine could still claim the evidence. It had not failed, it was being exercised. Then the approach itself hardened his confidence. Early on the 25th of October 1944, first contact with American light forces signaled that surprise was gone, but not that the attack was finished. This distinction mattered to him. A hidden approach was preferable, an exposed one was still possible. Japanese night doctrine did not depend on comfort. It depended on pressing through disorder faster than the defender could convert warning into destruction. so the continued movement north became its own kind of confirmation. The force had been found and was still advancing. An escort commander could have said it without drama. Contact does not end the operation. Maintain the attack. The flagship still had headway. The 25th of October 1944, in Surigao Strait, the arithmetic began to fail. First contact with American light forces had already told Nishimura that his approach was no longer secret. Yet the water ahead did not behave like an alerted anchorage waiting at the far end of Leyte Gulf. It behaved like a passage already divided into stages. American pressure did not arrive once. It arrived in layers. PT boats ahead. Destroyers farther on. A battle line beyond them. The route he intended to use as an avenue of attack had become a firing corridor before his van reached the northern exit. For the Japanese side, the number that would not close was simple: one strait, 3 separate American barriers. The doctrine Nishimura trusted had been built to pass one defended entrance and burst into open water beyond it. Instead, each mile north produced another contact and another response. The column was still moving. The count of obstacles kept growing faster than the route was shrinking. On the 24th of October 1944, in the Sulu Sea, Nishimura made the first visible adjustment by not making the one adjustment that would have ended the attempt. After air attack, he continued the south-to-north movement toward Surigao Strait, with the force still under command. That decision preserved the mission, but it also carried damaged ships and compressed timing into the channel ahead. One day's reaction was counted in one consequence. The force entered the night approach instead of abandoning it. Early on the 25th of October 1944, in Surigao Strait, Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf's defense announced itself through the light forces before the battleships were ever seen. Reports from escorts, gun flashes in darkness, and forced course changes told Nishimura that the American side was not merely present but arranged. He did not reverse the column. He kept pressing north after first contact had already stripped away surprise. The consequence was immediate and countable in form even before final losses could be measured. The attack had to pass at least 2 more American lines after the first warning had already been delivered. That was the real turn. Not fear. Adjustment. A veteran destroyer officer kept trusting a night thrust after air attack on the 24th of October 1944, and after exposed approach in Surigao Strait early on the 25th of October 1944, because those facts had once belonged to the normal cost of getting in close. But now they led to a different result. An officer in the screen could have said it in a clipped report: "We are under repeated contact and still not through." Ahead of Nishimura, the strait was still narrowing. Late on the 24th of October 1944, farther up the strait, the first American craft were already doing work that mattered without sinking anything big. PT boats made contact, reported bearings, and forced the Japanese column to answer. That answer cost Nishimura something his doctrine required: clean silence. In narrow water, every burst from a secondary battery, every turn made to meet a torpedo threat, every change in speed told the next American line where the column was and how it was moving. The force still had headway. It no longer had surprise in usable form. The subtraction was procedural before it was fatal. PT attacks from successive sectors made the approach a reported movement instead of a hidden one. Nishimura could still keep his ships going north, but he could not choose the terms of contact. He had to let escorts fire. He had to let lookouts and bridges work under repeated alarm. He had to accept that the water ahead was being informed in sequence. A night thrust built on concentration was being spent in fragments before it reached decisive range. After those first reports, the next loss was room. Surigao Strait narrowed the column into obedience, even while American contacts forced reaction. Nishimura could not spread into a broader attack front. He could not deploy for the kind of night action his service had once preferred. Yamashiro, Mogami, and the destroyers behind had to keep moving inside a channel that now punished every correction. A formation made to arrive in order was being compressed by geography, and by warning passed ahead of it. Space to recover disappeared before the main battery duel even began. Then came the torpedo attacks from both sides in the early hours of the 25th of October, 1944. American destroyers did not have to stop the advance in one blow. They only had to strip more control from a force already tracked, reported, and narrowed. Nishimura lost the ability to preserve a steady attacking shape. The column had to endure attacks from port and starboard while still trying to maintain northward movement. In that exchange, the Japanese force surrendered another asset that did not come back: formation integrity. The damage was not only to hulls, it was to sequence. A column attack depends on ordered intervals, understood station, and the confidence that the next ship astern is still where the flagship expects it to be. Torpedo pressure made that arithmetic unstable. Course changes under threat could save one ship and disorder three more. Smoke, flashes, and overlapping reports further thinned the flagship's reach. Nishimura was still commander of the force. His power to shape it in real time was being reduced to whatever orders could survive darkness, water, and damage. One part of that collapse became visible in the fate of Fusō. The Japanese attack had entered the strait as a two-battleship thrust. Before the northern exit was reached, that weight had already been broken. Whatever exact sequence Bridges perceived in the dark, the result was plain enough inside the command problem. Nishimura no longer possessed the concentrated heavy corps with which he had begun the run. A mission assigned to strike with battleships was moving toward the battle line, with that strength already cut apart. Mogami's position told the same story from another angle. The cruiser still moved north into the action, but it did so inside a force whose cohesion had been progressively damaged by contact passing, return fire, torpedo attack, and the channel itself. That meant Nishimura was now advancing with less than he had counted on in more than numbers alone. Less spacing, less mutual support, less certainty that damaged ships behind him could still contribute as planned. The Japanese attack was not being ended in one instant. It was being reduced step by step into a target stream. By the time the blocking force ahead prepared to open with heavier guns, Nishimura had lost the freedom to decide whether his night attack would arrive as a weapon or as remnants. The engine still drove him north. That is what makes the moment so severe. Forward motion survived longer than organized capacity. The mission was still being obeyed after the force that could carry it had already begun to come apart. A destroyer captain in that water could only judge the pattern in plain terms. We were being fired on and reported all the way in. Two battleships had become one effective heavy ship before the decisive gunfire was fully joined, and the final line ahead had not even spent its main weight. In the opening hours of the 25th of October 1944, the figure that had refused to close finally did close. The answer was not that Nishimura had met several separate American forces by chance. He had entered one managed system. PT boats found and reported. Destroyers attacked on prepared lines. Heavy ships farther north received a battle already measured for them. That was why the pressure repeated. It was not one lucky interception in darkness. It was contact passing, tied to radar search and fire control, turning each warning into the next engagement. That difference mattered because Japanese adjustment could answer one opponent and still fail against the whole chain. Nishimura could continue after air attack. He could continue after first contact. He could even continue after PT interference. In an older night action, persistence might still recover the initiative. Here it only advanced him from one informed American position to another. The hidden American advantage was not simply that ships waited ahead. It was that each layer helped the next one fight better than the last. By the time main batteries were to open, the target had already been tracked, shaped, and reduced. From the Japanese side, the natural answer was to press harder and keep coherence as long as possible. That is exactly what Nishimura did. He maintained the northward run instead of breaking contact and losing the mission outright. But the arithmetic was against him. Every minute spent preserving movement gave the American system another report, another bearing, another chance to place destroyers and ready the line beyond them. His doctrine taught that determination could compress the defender's time. The American arrangement turned time itself into the weapon used against him. That is why formation changes and local evasions could not restore control. A course change might answer a torpedo track. It did not erase the report already sent. Return fire might drive off a PT boat. It did not blind the battleships waiting ahead. Speed and persistence might carry a surviving ship farther north. They did not rebuild the formation already disrupted behind the flagship. Each Japanese adjustment solved the immediate danger nearest at hand while worsening the larger one still ahead. The force stayed in motion and became easier to finish. By then, desperation had entered in the only form available to a commander still under orders and still facing north. Not panic. Commitment without margin. Nishimura no longer had the option of a clean deployment into Leyte Gulf. He had only the option of reaching the northern end with whatever force remained. That is a much smaller ambition than the mission with which he started, and it shows how far the position had already decayed before the battle line fired. The American machine behind that decay also explains why the older Japanese confidence could not be recovered by courage, skill, or habit. The classic night thrust depended on the attacker forcing confusion on the defender at close range. In Surigao Strait, confusion accumulated first on the attacking side. Small craft imposed repeated alarms. Destroyer attacks bent the column. Radar directed the final gunnery problem onto ships already disordered. Each American element worked at a different range, but all of them acted on the same force in sequence. Nishimura was not losing to one surprise. He was being denied the chance to reset the fight. That left his command with a brutal operational conclusion before the final salvos landed. The attack could still continue physically, while it had already ceased to exist as an organized breakthrough. It still had ships. It no longer had the margin needed to arrive as a coherent striking force. That is the point at which a doctrine survives in obedience after it has failed in function. A staff judgment from that side would have been cold and exact. The enemy knew our advance at each stage and met it in order. 3 American barriers had become one connected system, and what remained ahead was the gun line across the northern mouth. Before dawn on the 25th of October 1944, the last approach still looked, from a bridge, like movement that might yet carry through. Yamashiro continued north. Mogami followed into smoke, gun flashes, and the compressed wake of ships forced to hold course in a channel already alive with hostile reports. Destroyers that remained with the force were no longer screening a hidden thrust. They were escorting damaged momentum. Nishimura still had engines, signals, and a route that led straight ahead. He did not have the force he had started with. The next subtraction was command in the full sense of the word. Orders can be made on a bridge. They still have to cross water, smoke, noise, and damage. By the time the Japanese van neared the northern end of Surigao Strait, those conditions had already thinned what any flagship could control. Ships astern had been forced by torpedo attack and confusion. Fusō was gone from the effective line of battle. The force that remained was narrower, hurt, and still advancing, because the alternative was to concede the passage without ever striking. That is not the same thing as retaining tactical freedom. Ahead, Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf had already laid his line across the exit. The Japanese thrust that had been built to break into Leyte Gulf was now entering the one zone where its preferred range became fatal to it. West Virginia opened effective fire by radar-directed control in darkness. Tennessee and California also fired by radar-directed control. Some other American battleships had poorer firing opportunities because smoke, confusion, and target masking interfered. None of that changed the decisive fact for Nishimura. The water in front of him had been turned into a gunnery problem he could not see and could not solve first. For Yamashiro, this was the reversal. A battleship pressing a night attack had reached the range where heavy guns should have given it authority. Instead, that range delivered measured American salvos onto a target already stripped of surprise and cohesion. Nishimura had trusted the final approach enough to stay in it after air attack, after first contact, after PT tracking, and after destroyer torpedoes. Now the surviving center of his command was under fire from ships he could not engage on equal terms in the dark. The old surface battle method had reached the point it was supposed to dominate. It did not dominate there. Mogami endured the same collapse from the trailing side of the action. The cruiser had come forward as part of a concentrated attack column. Under the battle line's fire and in the wreckage of the passage, it became part of a broken force trying to survive inside an engagement already decided by American plotting and timing. Its damage in the strait was not an isolated ship's misfortune. It was the visible proof that the entire attacking shape had been dismantled before it could deploy against the invasion fleet. Shigure's survival makes the destruction around it plainer, not less severe. One destroyer escaped. That fact does not restore a force commander, 2 battleships, or a mission. It marks the scale of what failed to get through. Nishimura was killed in the battle. Yamashiro was lost. Fusō was lost. Mogami was crippled in the action and did not survive the larger battle sequence. The southern force did not break into Leyte Gulf. It broke in the strait. Set beside the opening promise of the attack, the numbers are severe in their simplicity. 6 U.S. battleships barred the northern exit. 2 Japanese battleships entered the passage as the weight of the thrust. Both were lost. Most of the attacking power was destroyed in the run north. The force that wanted decisive night surface range reached that range only after the American system had already made it helpless. For the men still alive on the Japanese side, the conclusion no longer needed argument. The channel had carried them exactly where they had intended to fight, and there they were finished under radar-directed gunfire from a prepared line. That is why the collapse was institutional as well as physical. A navy had kept trusting a form of attack after the conditions that once made it dangerous had been removed. In Surigao Strait, the order was still being obeyed after the force needed to fulfill it had ceased to